Okay, good morning or afternoon. Let's talk about the dodo bird. So on Friday, I asked you to read Activity 101, Birds of a Feather. And the challenge for that, you should have seen in the book, was that how does natural selection help explain the extinction of the dodo bird and the success of the common pigeon? Okay, so um, you should have read about how the dodo bird migrated from the mainland to the island of Mauritius and how it was pretty successful there until humans showed up. And when humans showed up and brought other mammals with them, the humans ate the dodo bird and the other animals fed off of their eggs because they were an easy target, laying their nests on the ground. And then you should have read that the dodo bird, it turns out, is very close related to pigeons. Turns out they're more like cousins. So we know that because we were able to get a DNA sample from a preserved pigeon back in 2002. Um, what happened with the pigeon was humans started to domesticate pigeons, which means they started to capture the wild pigeons and they trained them and first they ate them for food and then they learned to train them to deliver messages and to um, do tricks and to race and do all kind of other things. And the pigeons started to live near the humans because they were able to eat scraps and make nests in their buildings. And so they started to adapt genetically to live near the humans, but their DNA remained similar enough that they could still mate with some of the wild pigeons and they were able to exchange some DNA and share traits. And now we see the pigeons that live near people, we refer to them as feral pigeons. And the wild pigeons are actually dwindling, their numbers are actually decreasing. So that's what the article was about. Let's take a look at what you came up with for your analysis answers. For number one, you were supposed to say, if humans had never interacted with either the dodo or the pigeon, how do you think their history would have changed? So, had humans never um, took pigeons into captivity, what do you think would have happened to those pigeons? And if humans would have never landed on the island of Mauritius, what would have happened to the dodo? And what you should have come up with was that without human contact, the pigeon probably would have just remained wild. It would have had different characteristics. It still would have been successful. Um, it wouldn't have branched out as far because the article told us that the wild pigeon has a more limited range and it probably would not have gotten, it wouldn't have spread out as far like the pigeons of today have, and it probably wouldn't have had to been able to increase its numbers. Without humans, the dodo bird would have been fine. They would have just continued on that island. No mammals were just going to show up, and they had plenty of food. Um, they would have just kept doing what they were doing. But once humans changed the environment, and how they changed the environment was they changed the predator prey situation. By doing that, the dodos did not have enough time to adapt to that changing environment. By eating the eggs, it reduced the number of dodos that were born, which would have changed the number of offspring and the number of possible mutations that could have occurred. And the dodo didn't really have time to adapt or change, so therefore it went extinct. So that one was on humans. We did that to the dodo for sure. Okay. Number two said, could the evolution of feral pigeons be described as the formation of a new species? So the key to that one is that the feral pigeons can still reproduce with the wild pigeons. It told you that they can share their genes. So for number two, you would say that the evolution is in process and speciation is probably happening, but because they can still produce hybrids and they can still reproduce together, we would say that they're not specifically two different species yet, but that is probably happening. Okay. Number 4 said, your friend argues that the dodo bird became extinct because it was a poorly adapted species destined for failure. Do you agree or not? I hope that you said you did not agree. The dodo bird wasn't that it was poorly adapted, but it was really well adapted to the island. When it got there, it could fly. But as it turns out, it didn't need to fly. So birds that maybe weren't as good of flyers, that maybe spent their time on the ground, probably were more successful. And so those traits stuck around. The birds that flew more didn't need to fly, and they were less likely to find food. So it wasn't that the dodo bird was not adapted to the island of Mauritius. It was really, really well adapted. Okay, so that whenever the environment changed, when there were new species or predators introduced, they couldn't adapt to that change. There wasn't enough variation. All the dodos were the same. They were all doing the same thing. There was nothing that made any of them better at that time. So it's important here to note that the process of natural selection is really slow, and it's unable to produce a modified species fast enough for the dodo before the last dodo died. So remember, those mutations are completely random. They don't happen just because you need them to. We could talk about the polar bears, and that's kind of what's going on with them. So we'll talk about that. But had there been more time before all the eggs had been eaten, there might have been a different dodo mutation, maybe a larger dodo, or maybe something that allowed it to coexist or live with the mammals, but there just wasn't enough time. And I think we're seeing that a little bit with the polar bears. So if you think about polar bears, they're all really well adapted to the Arctic. They all have that thick fur, they have the white fur, so they blend in, the black skin underneath. We talked about how that lets them pull in that heat and stay warm. Their big paws help them break the ice. They are super, super adapted to the Arctic climate. And so what's happening as the climate changes, there's no polar bears that are better suited. They're all kind of in a bad spot. And I don't know if we're going to have enough time, depending on how quickly the ice melts, if the polar bears will have enough time to wait for a random mutation to happen. So we may get to see that play out in real time, which would be kind of cool to see. Okay, number 5 was, it's just an opinion question, and it was what you thought we should and shouldn't do with the woolly mammoth. Remember, that's where we started, and what we should do with the dodo bird. So you could have did pros or cons. So I gave a bunch of different choices. You might have said that we should recreate the mammoth because, if you remember, humans helped to cause their extinction. We could study the woolly mammoths. We could add new food source to the Arctic food web. There's not a ton of food in the Arctic, so that might be a good thing. Reasons we might not want to recreate the woolly mammoth and release them into the Arctic is the climate's changing, and so it's not the same habitat, and they kind of went extinct a little bit because the climate changed the first time. We could talk about how they could disrupt the current food web that's there. Putting them in might actually be a bad thing. It's going to cost a lot of money to do, and some people would tell you that the woolly mammoths went extinct the first time because they weren't able to adapt, so putting them back into the changing climate would be unsuccessful. In terms of the dodo bird, again, you could go either way with him. People who would argue that we should recreate the dodo bird, you could have said that it was our fault, right? So that maybe we have an obligation to try and bring them back. We could say that the environment in terms of temperature and climate and food sources hasn't changed that much. They should be okay. We could study them in captivity. I've had students tell me we could eat them. You never know. We could go to Dino's for Tuesday night dodo wings. And they're not dangerous. The dodo bird was not a dangerous bird, and so it wouldn't hurt. We could argue that it wouldn't hurt us. You might say we should not recreate the dodo bird because the ecosystem is different. There's different predators and prey. In the reading, it told you that there are now over 1 million people that live on that island. So we went from no people to 1 million people. That's a big difference since the dodo birds were around. We could argue that they couldn't adapt to humans and other animals the first time. They probably wouldn't be successful. We could say it costs a lot of money. It could still disrupt the ecosystem in some way, taking food from maybe another predator. Or you could say that we could study extinction from another endangered species, that we wouldn't need to study the dodo bird to get to the same result. So as long as you had one of those things, that would be great. I just wanted you to think about it. Okay, so your assignment today, this is another graded one, is your last natural selection graded analysis question. So listen, this is like the 4th or 5th time you have had to do a natural selection analysis question. And I have found myself typing very similar comments for a lot of you who maybe missed the point. And a lot of you have done really, really well. So I want to just make sure to explain it to you correctly. Here's what you're going to do. The question says to use natural selection to explain how the flying bird that first, this should say first, settled on Mauritius. Hold on, let me fix that. Use natural selection to explain how the flying bird that first settled on Mauritius might have evolved into the flightless dodo. So the first thing there, guys, listen. The dodo bird, when it originally got to the island, could fly. It flew from the mainland. It didn't just show up there, okay? So originally the dodo bird could fly. By the end, though, none of the dodo birds flew anymore. They all nested on the ground and ate the fruit that fell from the trees. So what I want you to do is explain to me how I get a bird that could fly to a population of birds that none of them flew. And in your answer, you have to use the role of mutations. You have to talk about the mutations in there. You also want to remember to use the terms that we've said and I have typed in my comments over and over. When you are talking about natural selection, you have to talk about variation in the population. You have to talk about some of those animals being better suited. And you have to talk about the ones that are better suited survive and reproduce. So you have to put that into a nice big paragraph for me. I would say minimum 5 sentences, minimum, okay? I want you to type it out, explain it to me, almost like you're telling me the story of the dodo bird, except it's a science story. And I want you to tell it through the perspective of natural selection, okay? It's a 10-point analysis. It's the last time we're going to do natural selection for an analysis. I really want you to give me your best. If you are not sure what to do, I want you to send me an email. If we need to work on it one-on-one, we can. We just need to set that up, okay? Otherwise, I look forward to reading your responses. All right, guys, good luck. Thanks for checking in.